appreciate everyone's attention late in this morning like this. Basically, I have something a little bit different to talk about right now. So I'm talking about kind of, a lot of the talks before have been very much focused on requirements across the board, thinking about how do we approach policies, how do we approach standards, elements like that. I'm going to go really deep in one specific area, and that's cryptography, which is my background, so this is something that I have a lot of fun with, and we do at ISARA. So there's this work going on around the world right now in this field of what's called quantum information science. And there's enormous investments happening. So here in the UK, over the last 5 years, there's been about £250 million which have gone into the different innovation hubs spread throughout the different universities here in the United Kingdom. You have similar efforts in the US, where they just passed a bill for $1.2 billion to spend for a national strategy around quantum information science. You have the EU has $1 billion program right now, which they're in the middle of working through. Even little Canada is doing work in this space here as well too. And interestingly, in China, they just announced about 6 months ago $10 billion investment going into research parks, and then Alibaba has kicked in essentially the same amount of money as well too. And that's sort of at a governmental level. Of course, you have all the big ICT vendors, you have Microsoft, Google, Intel, IBM, sort of smaller specific ones like Rigetti, who are all getting into this space here as well too. And so there's this giant growth happening. And so the big question is why? Why are people trying to build quantum computers? Basically, they can solve problems that we can't solve today. I'll give you one specific example. We spend about 3% of all of the energy produced every year to make fertilizers. Now, fertilizers are really important to us then. Obviously, look outside, see gardens around us. We have food that we like to eat. We require fertilizers to allow us to grow them. Now, the problem is that's a lot of energy in terms of that industrialized process then. Now, nature is very good at producing fertilizers. If anyone has a compost heap in their backyard, they know about the process. You put waste food in there, maybe a little bit of dirt, worms do their work, eventually you have fertilizer at the end. Wouldn't it be great if there was a way for us to industrialize that process in a more efficient manner? And we actually do know a way to do this then. Actually, Microsoft has shown there's a quantum chemistry problem that we can solve efficiently in order to allow us to deal with this problem. Unfortunately, it requires a quantum computer to do that then. There's other similar types of problems out there in pharmaceuticals and energy transfer and material science, all of these interesting areas there that seem to apply themselves very well in the case of quantum technologies then. Of course, it's not all sunshine and puppies here. Quantum computers are also very good at some other problems. And unfortunately, one of the problems it's really good at solving underlies the mathematics that we use for much of the cryptography on the internet. Specifically, quantum computers have this algorithm called Shor's algorithm, which is very good at solving the math behind RSA and elliptic curves. And as you know, in the IoT space, those are the math algorithms which we use from a public key perspective to do things like software updates, to do things like key establishment between clients and servers. So this is important. We need to start thinking about the implications associated with this then. Now, obviously, if we think about it from a big governmental level, there's a lot of concerns from a national defense perspective then in terms of how do networks get updated then. And it's important, we'll talk a little bit about the amount of time spent to upgrade networks, but if you think about how cryptography is used broadly speaking across the ICT industry, it's everywhere. And that's great. That's a great success that we've seen as the proliferation of cryptography. It does also imply that there's a lot of work that we need to do as we start to move past that. And it's helpful to kind of point out kind of what that impact actually is. We've dealt with before where we have cryptographic algorithms we use, like triple DES, before that DES, AES, and all of those, and we've kind of done this lockstep where we move through different algorithms there. And why have we done that? Well, because we've started to find issues with those algorithms, and computers get better, algorithms get better to attack them, and so we need to make keys bigger then. Now, the challenge in this case here is that quantum computers are not just better at solving these problems, they can efficiently solve some of these problems here. So we need to effectively change the solutions that we use. And it's helpful to remember cryptography, my background is mathematics. Cryptography is a component which is used within all of these things. And there's certain assumptions that we make, how long it takes to generate a key, how big keys are, that then get reflected in the protocols that we build on top of it then. There's a retry mechanism in the TLS server, which is running across a large F5. When it's trying to do all of these different calculations at the same time, there's assumptions implicitly in there in terms of how long calculations take. We need to make sure we think through all of these when we start changing the crypto. And then if I'm an IoT vendor, I may just be using cryptography in the context of OpenSSL, where I don't actually know anything about crypto. I'm just calling a library. Magic is happening under the covers then. There might be assumptions there that I've built into my own protocol then in terms of the amount of power that the crypto steps are going to take that I may need to take into consideration here. And it's helpful to think about some specific examples. Let's think about software updates then. We've talked about in a few of the previous talks about how important it is to have software updates. Those are in the keynotes as well. This is where crypto comes up. How does a software update work? Well, I manufacture an IoT device. I'm going to embed some root of trust into it then, typically a public key. I'm going to then send it out into the field. And then later on, I'm going to send a software update, and that software update will be digitally signed using the private key associated with that, which will go to the device then. All well and good. Except the challenge becomes that with a quantum computer, you can't necessarily trust the security of that digital signature anymore. And so then I need to think about, well, how do I change those roots of trust in those devices then? And that may not be something that I can do in the field then. I'll skip this one here as well too. Similar problem happens with encryption. So let's talk about timeframes here, because I'm conscious of timeframes in here as well too. When do we need to worry about this problem? So Tyson in the keynote this morning mentioned one of the dates which is brought up here. There's basically kind of two dates we typically play with then. And I'm going to use sort of an example of durable IoT, because I think that's a great one to use. Let's say we have a car which is going to be on the roads in 2035. Now, let's think about when this actually starts to take place then. So a couple dates to kind of put in the sand here. So Mike Mosca, Professor Mosca from the University of Waterloo, he said, call it a 1 in 6 chance of a quantum computer in 2026 that would be big enough to break RSA. Let's call it an optimistic forecast. NIST has come out and said, call it 2030, 2031. For when they expect quantum computers to be big enough to cause a threat there. So we'll ignore those. Let's picture a car that's in the road in 2035. So we'll be conservative, I guess, in this case then. When do I need to start to worry about things? So a car on the road in 2035 is typically going to be on the road for, call it 11 and a half years. Data says between 11 to 15 years is how long a car is typically on the road for then. So then how long does it take to actually design that car? Typical design frames are about 6 to 8 years from beginning of design cycle to actually car ready for in the market then. So it tells you a car on the road in 2035 started design 2 or 3 years ago. So when we start, the point of this then is not to make you scared. The point of this is to highlight the fact that the time it takes to fix cryptography is long. It takes a lot of time to do the standards. It's a lot of time to do the academic work with it, a lot of time to do the low-level implementations for it, and then to be ready to start deploying that. Similarly, if we're thinking about this in terms of, say, a durable IoT product that's going to be in field for 30 years, presentation on the power grid this morning. If you think about, I'm Canadian, so I'll use the word hydro all the time then, but if we think about the power meter that's at your house, there is a sensor there which is reading your power usage then. There is cryptography which is used on that to allow it to report back into the environment, back into the system, how much is being used there. In North America, that's using ECDSA. So that's the algorithm which is used to protect that then. Those are designed to be out there for 20 or 30 years. So again, in certain scenarios, there is work that needs to happen sooner rather than later to get systems ready. So how? What do we actually do about this then? There's two basic ways to deal with this problem then. We'll call it basically physics and math. You can guess what sort of side I live on in this case then. But the physics approach is to use something called quantum key distribution, which is the idea of basically sharing photons between two people in particular states, that you can use that as a way to share keys between them. It's a key establishment mechanism then. It generally relies upon fiber optic connections or satellite to telescope type connections then. The other way is to use something called quantum safe cryptography, which is effectively a drop-in replacement to what you use today. So instead of RSA, you're going to use a lattice scheme or something like that then. I'll affectionately call those the new math. Don't worry about learning any of the topics in here. The math gets really nerdy really quick, which is part of the fun at this stage then as well too. The reason I want to show this though is to help you understand that we've been very lucky with RSA and elliptic curves, meaning that they're very sturdy. You can use, if you have an elliptic curve, you can use that to build a key establishment system. You can use a way to set up authentication with digital signatures. Keys are quite small. It's very efficient then. Fortunately, we don't have that free lunch anymore. With sort of these new math schemes here, they're all special snowflakes. Some of them are great for some areas. Some of them are not great for those same areas then. Hash-based signatures, I'll give you an example there. Hash-based signatures were developed in about 1977 by Ralph Merkle with a lot of work from a number of other folks. They basically, this idea of a big binary tree, which has things called one-time signatures at the bottom of them then. They are extremely well trusted from a security perspective. Unfortunately, they have this idea of state with them now, where it means that I only can sign so many messages. Am I going to use that for the TLS connection between my desktop and Amazon? Probably not. But if I think about an IoT system where I need to worry about software updates, or maybe I'm only going to be sending out 10,000 software updates, probably not, but less than that then, but a fixed number of software updates, that might actually be a reasonable system to deploy then. And that's trusted, and that's actually at the, I'll call it at the slushy stages from a standardization perspective then. Some of the other schemes, they need some more work from the academic scrutiny side and from the standard side as well. Now the challenge with all of these here is that basically what we're talking about is a transition process. We're in a state today where we're using what we would call classical cryptography. We're going to eventually be in a state where we're using quantum safe cryptography, and we're in the mushy middle in here. And so the question becomes, how do we do this type of upgrade? How do we do this type of transition in a manner which is not break existing systems, is going to keep the cost of transition as low as possible, so the switching cost as low as possible then, but then also recognizes the complexity of how cryptography is used. In a previous job, I did a lot of work with the US Department of Defense, their PKI. This PKI uses smart cards for credential storage. There's about 3.5 million users on it. They use their PKI, which is this web, which would break that screen if you put it up on there as well too, across all the different agencies that make up the Department of Defense, along with all the different defense contractors, and then all of the different subservient agencies there. So if I'm, say, in the military, then I'm going to be using my credentials to access Veterans Affairs systems then. I may be doing work with Boeing or Lockheed, so I access their systems as well too, or they access mine then. So this is an interweaved web of a PKI, but then all of the applications that it depends on. And when we do think about how we do transitions, we have to think about how do we actually upgrade all those systems in the most cost-effective way. And I'll use a buzzword which was talked a lot about in some of the previous sessions is crypto agility. So this idea of how do we allow ourselves to basically have the time to do the transitions then. And what's talked about a lot now is this concept of what are called hybrid schemes. What they recognize is the fact that I'll talk about some of the standards in a moment, but we may still be 5 or 6 years away from fully standardized systems from a crypto primitive perspective then. And so in some cases, let's say you have a system that's sending out encrypted information today on the internet that you need to be secure in 20 years. Maybe it's health information, maybe it's some other governmental information then, maybe Coke for some reason is sending the Coke recipe across the internet, which they probably shouldn't do. You need to start thinking about, well, that data is actually at risk 20 years from now because if there's nation states that we know of that store encrypted traffic on the internet for later analysis. Quantum computer would allow them to do that later analysis. So you have to make that risk mitigation discussion to say, if I send something today that has to be secure in 20 years, do I need to take steps today to make sure that's protected there? And that's where these hybrid types of schemes come in, where basically a hybrid scheme is I use classical crypto, I use a lattice scheme, I use a quantum safe scheme, that's my favorite, and then I combine them together to get an existing key, and I use that key for protecting information then. It's very, very safe from an audit perspective then as well too. But all of these are predicated on the fact that we need standards around these systems then. Much like the previous presenter said, there are a lot of standards that are out there that talk about cryptography, and they go everything from what I would consider to be the core ones that really define the use of a lot of cryptography, and then very much vertical specific ones. So some of the big ones. So NIST is doing a competition right now based out of the US, looking at what are going to be the quantum safe algorithm standards in the future. This is very similar to what they've done in the past with AES, with the SHAs, so the hash functions out there as well too. They are, call it about a year and a half into the process right now. They're forecasting, call it between 2022 and 2024 when they start being done. And they may not necessarily be done at that point then. That may just be the first stage of algorithms then. So what we know is that there will be multiple schemes that are standardized at the end where, as I mentioned before, you pick one depending on the use case that you have in mind then. You have ETSI down in France, which does a lot of work in telecom standards, so in the GSMs, 3G, 4G, et cetera there. They have a quantum safe working group that's been going for over 4 years now. They're looking at more sort of a layer up from the algorithms around how do you use some of these schemes, what are the implications there. For example, they just announced a work item looking at hybrid key establishment. You have a ton of work going on in the IETF right now, and both in the IETF and the IRTF, depending on your level of knowledge in that group then, where they're looking at some algorithms, such as those hash-based signatures I mentioned, but then also how do we do things like hybrid use cases in TLS, hybrid use cases in IKE, some work in some of the PKI areas then. ITUT is doing work in that same area then, and then ISO is sort of, I would call it in the early stages of a lot of work here as well. And then of course industry verticals like X9 for financial, SAE for automotive, Secure Chorus here in the UK for Secure Comms then as well too. So there's an enormous amount of work that's out there going in there. They also need to be interrelated to each other then as well too, because there's no point in having these run in parallel from each other then. But I think if I was going to leave anything with people here is that, this is partially a public safety announcement to let you know about a threat that's coming, but partially also to get the kernel in the back of your head to start thinking about planning. From an ICT network perspective, a cryptographic transition is just like any other large-scale IT transition. It just takes a while. A bank will typically be, according to their own estimates, 7 to 10 years. The federal government is typically 13 to 20 years for a crypto transition. Depending on your organization, depending on your products. Think about how durable your products. If you have a throwaway product that is no longer supported after a year, probably not too worried about this threat today. But if you are doing work in an industrial IoT setting where you have products that need to last for 10 plus years, time is probably right to start thinking about these. So I'll be around. Reach out to me, mike@isara.com. Happy to answer any questions, and I'll be here for most of the rest of the day too. So thank you.